everyone, it's Kenji. How's it going? Today we are doing some more knife skills videos. We're talking about onions. So onions, the main thing to notice about onions is that they are not, perfectly spherical. They've got dimensionality to them. They've got a direction to them. So if we call, this is the root end, this is the stem end. If we think of those, think of it sort of as a planet, where this is the North Pole and the South Pole. What I call orbital cuts are the ones that go around this way when you're slicing the onion like that, whereas pole-to-pole cuts are ones where you cut the onion like that. This can actually have a big difference in the flavor of the onion. Here, let me start by cutting it open and showing you a little bit. So no matter how you're going to cut the onion, you want to start by trimming off the stem end. Okay. And now when we're going to slice it, we're going to split it in half first. And now here's where your decision comes in, whether you want to cut pole-to-pole or orbitally. First, I'm going to peel off these outer layers. One thing that, it looks like I'm wasting this outer layer, this layer of the onion. I'm taking off a little bit more than the skin. This is a thing that, I used to try and take off just that first, just that papery skin. Just that papery skin, until one day, I was working in a restaurant and Jacques Pepin, who's like my idol, he was dining there, and he came into the kitchen afterwards and started talking to me, and he noticed that I was taking off just the skin of the onion, and he advised that I take off the skin and the first layer, because that first layer can be a little bit tough. And after thinking about it and trying it side by side, turns out he's right, obviously. So I do try and take off that very first layer of onion as well, because it can be a little bit tougher compared to the rest of the onion. Now, so your onion, the cells in an onion are actually one of the few cells, plant cells that you can see with the naked eye. You can see it, especially in a red onion, it's a lot easier to see. But the way the cells are lined up, they are longer going this way than they are going that way. So why is that important? Well, it's important because onions, within their cells, they contain they contain an enzyme. They contain these precursor chemicals that combine together and form the sort of sulfurous compounds that give them that really pungent flavor. And I've talked about this a zillion times, but I'm going to keep talking about it. They contain these precursor chemicals that once you cut the cells open, they combine and form those compounds that make your eyes all teary. They make the onion smell really pungent, and they kind of cover up some of the sweeter, more subtle flavors of the onions. So depending on how you slice it, the number of cells you rupture will change. So I have a little visual aid today. So if you imagine this, so these are onion cells, right? So imagine that this is pole to pole, whereas this way is cutting lengthwise. So if you cut an onion pole to pole, do a stroke like that, you're cutting open 1, 2, 3 cells that way, okay? Obviously this is just a ratio and this is all blown up, but then if you cut it the other way, you're cutting through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cells, and that line is actually even shorter than this one. So anyhow, depending on the direction that you slice the onion, you're going to open up more cells and release more or less of those precursor chemicals. So your onion will become more or less pungent. So if you're cutting onions this way, this is orbitally. The way you would cut, say, onion rings. That's how you get sort of really pungent, strong onions. Whereas if you cut the other way, and to cut the other way, we're going to trim off the root end first. If you cut the other way, you get milder, sweeter onions. So of course the choice is yours, whether you want your onion really mild or really pungent. And once you cook them, a lot of those flavors sort of even out anyway. So some of it comes down to textural differences. But for the most part, I tend to cut my onions this way, pole to pole. All right. So, and when you're cutting your onions, trim off the top end, trim off the root end, hand in a claw like this, thumb tucked behind, so that you don't cut your fingertips off. And then the rate at which you move your fingers back is going to determine how thick those slices are. So those are real thin slices. We can do thicker slices by moving our fingers back a little further. And then what I like to do is when I get down to this part, you'll notice that the onion gets a little bit precarious. It doesn't really balance on its end very well. So at this point, I will flatten it out like this, turn it around so that I have a wider base, and then keep cutting like that. And I might even do that a few times. Just like that. So let me show you start to finish on this half. So we've trimmed off the front end. We're going to pull off the first layer of the skin. And then I'm going to trim off the root end. And then we're going to slice like this. And that's how you slice an onion. Grab my... So now let's talk about how you dice an onion. This is where things get a little more fun. There's some math involved. All right, so to dice an onion, we're going to start the same basic way. We're going to trim off the stem end. We're going to split it in half. And then we're going to peel that outer layer. Let me do both of them. By the way, if you're doing a whole bunch of onions at once, or anytime you're prepping anything where you have a bunch of repeated tasks, what I find really helps is if you think about the way sort of like a factory would be laid out, where rather than doing one piece from start to finish, you batch your tasks. So if you have a whole bunch of onions, split them all in half first, then take off all the peels, and then start dicing them all together. That way you're not sort of switching back and forth between tasks, and you don't have to put your knife up and down. I try and think about it sort of the way a machine would be set up in a factory. Just think of yourself as a cog in the wheel of an onion factory. All right, so now when we're dicing onions, there's a couple of ways that you can do it. So the real traditional way, I don't know, Michael, if you want to get back here and look, the real traditional way, the way like Jacques Pepin would tell you to do if you look in his book, is to go basically straight up and down like this. And you think of it sort of as a grid, straight up and down like that, and then holding your knife horizontally, you go across once like that, okay? And then you get it in the third dimension. That's the sort of traditional way. That's the way they would teach you at culinary school. But there are other ways, obviously, to dice an onion. Let me show you a second way. So the problem with that way, there's a couple things. One of them, the main one is that you're cutting a grid. However, onions are not orthogonally symmetrical. They're radially symmetrical. So some folks suggest that rather than cutting a grid, instead of these first cuts being straight up and down, you aim radially, right? So you aim towards sort of the center of the onion like that. And that way your cuts are all symmetrical. So your knife kind of goes in at a 90-degree angle. And what that does is it saves you from having to do this horizontal cut because you've narrowed down these sides enough. However, what happens is if you look at the center here, what you'll find is that your pieces are pretty wide up here, but then as you get towards the center, they get more and more narrow. You see, so you get these sort of wedge shapes that get narrower and narrower. So your onion pieces actually end up a little bit less evenly diced when you do this. So what I did was I had a friend from college who is a mathematician, and I had him build a little computer model of an onion so that we could sort of calculate what we wanted to calculate was how many, the most efficient way essentially to slice an onion. So how you can get an onion into the most even pieces using the fewest number of knife strokes. And what we found was this. Let's start this again. This is a white onion, by the way. White onions, yellow onions, red onions, the way you cut them are all going to be essentially the same because they're all just different variations on the same theme. What we found was this. So rather than going straight up and down, and rather than going directly radially, what we found is that if you aim for a spot so if you imagine that the height of the onion here, let's call that 1. If you aim for a spot that's 0.6 below the surface of the cutting board, that's actually the most efficient way to cut an onion. You get the most even number of pieces and in the fewest number of knife strokes. What does that look like in reality? Well, nobody's going to take a ruler out and measure that. But what it really means is that rather than aiming straight up and down, and rather than aiming radially symmetrically, you kind of want to aim just like loosely somewhere below the cutting board. So I imagine my knife moving towards a point right around there. All right. So it means not quite up and down. So just kind of like a lazy radial cut is what you do, right? And from there, then you can do this one horizontal cut, which will help a little bit. It's not really that necessary, but it does help if you want it a little more even. And then finally, same as when you're doing slices, you want to keep a claw here and separate it out. Now, an onion, you can keep going that way. The same thing, I like to do the same thing when I'm dicing my onion as I do when I'm slicing it. So once it starts to get a little bit unstable, instead of continuing to try and cut that way, I'll just lean it down that way. And sometimes if I want it even more perfectly diced, I will add these sort of a new set of horizontal cuts there, you know. I do this mainly because when I don't, people tell me that I waste my onion. To be honest, I've never met anyone in a restaurant who would get their onion down to this little nub. But if you want to be very what's the word? I don't know. Not wasteful with your onion. What's the word for not wasteful? Resourceful. Sure, resourceful. That's a good word. Then you can do that with your onion. And is that it? We've done slicing and dicing. What else do you do with an onion? I think that's it. Oh, the other thing you can do if you want really super even dice, and this is what we would do like if I was working at a fancy restaurant where we had, say, you know, like a salad that had, you know, like maybe we're doing like a fancy poke, you know, where you have you want really even dice of onions, where you have something like a sweet onion that you're going to be serving raw. If you want an even more even dice of onion, what you can do is you can cut it open like that, separate your layers out. You know, so start with a couple of layers and then stack those layers, cut them across this way and then across the other way. And that way you can sort of really fine tune the size of your dice and make sure that they're all nice and even. This is not something that I think any home cook should ever have to do, but it is a technique that sometimes you would use in a restaurant if you wanted really evenly diced onions. And it's much more sort of about the you know, the visual appeal as it is about anything else. So you get these really nice little squares. So there we go. Diced onions, sliced onions, and restaurant-style diced onions. By the way, with those sliced onions, if you really want a good demonstration of how cutting the onions in different directions will change the smell. I've shown this in other videos before also, but get yourself a little container, a sealed container, cut your onion one way, pole to pole, and then slice it the other way. And cut half of the onion pole to pole and half of the onion orbitally, put them in 2 containers, close the lids, let them sit side by side for 15 minutes or so, and then open them up and smell the difference. And you'll see how big a difference actually cutting the onions can make. Oh, one last thing. So people talk about, you know, if you want to know about how to not cry when you're cutting onions, there's a few techniques. So really what you're trying to do is make sure that those lacrimators, the chemicals that come out from the insides of the onions, don't reach your eyes. The easiest way is to do what I do, which is wear contact lenses. Contact lenses solve that problem easily. What I do with my kids is I put on swim goggles. Ski goggles don't really work because they're breathable, so those gases will get inside your eyes. So swim goggles really work. All of the other techniques, like lighting a candle nearby, making sure your onions are cold, those can very minimally help. But really the only thing that you can do is completely protect your eye from the onion. Having a sharp knife also helps because with a sharper knife, you're slicing through cells as opposed to crushing them. And so you aren't really squeezing out as much of those juices. So that's it, onions. I hope that was useful. Guys, gals, non-binary pals, see you next time.